In this tutorial, we'll be working with the file Working with Color. The Grasshopper file is structured so that we build up step by step by step. So starting from the top, this means that a lot of things are not previewed. So we'll be previewing and unpreviewing things as we go. If we right click and go here to preview, the node turns a lighter gray and we can actually see the geometry. And note for this tutorial, I do have all the geometry visible at once, so the green and white canister is turned off. So in other words, we are previewing everything globally, but then locally we're not previewing certain things. So when we've drawn here a series of 20 circles, right now this just exists in the Grasshopper file. It does not exist in RhinoSpace. It's not selectable. If we right click and go to bake, which is the fried egg icon, this takes something that's in Grasshopper and makes it actual Rhino geometry that's no longer associated with Grasshopper. Once we've baked it to a layer, we can select these circles as a separate thing in Rhino and move them around, and they are no longer affected by anything we do in Grasshopper. Let's move to the next phase of this tutorial, which looks at color. And in order to see the subtlety of color, I'm going to unpreview this first set of circles. So the portion in red remains the same, and then this portion in orange is new. And what I've done here is added a node that is a custom preview. This and many other of the nodes we'll use today is in the display tab here, custom preview, and then also there's a bunch of things having to do with color over here. This has two inputs. One is the geometry, which can be curves, surfaces, whatever, and the other is the material. We're just dealing with a material as color. The other thing I've added is a color picker, which is not in the display, but in the parameters tab under input. And this is a color picker. This allows us to visually see what shade of color is coming out from some combination of hue, saturation, and value, which are given by sliders down here. And you can see as we're moving around in hue, saturation, and value that the color of the circles are changing. Let's move to the next part where we begin to set up something that will anticipate variable color. So I'm going to unpreview what we just did with the color picker, and we're now going to use something that, back to the display, is a color, same thing, hue, saturation, value, but instead of visually inputting it with the sliders, we're going to numerically input the values for each. Each of these inputs is expecting something that happens in the range between 0 to 1. So the hue ranges from 0 to 1, the saturation and the value. I've put in two sliders, and we can see that now if this is previewed, if we slide the sliders for saturation and hue, the color of all the circles change. Moving on, let's unpreview this, and for the next step we need to understand something that's called a domain and a range. So a domain is simply a set of an upper and lower bound. A range is a series within a domain. Unlike the other kind of series we've been working on that goes on and on and on depending on the count, this one is limited by an upper value. So within our domain of 0 to 1, we can divide it into a number of steps. So for example, if we divide the domain 0 to 1 into 3 steps, and remember that's really 4 steps because the first index number is 0, this is the resulting range of numbers. So every time we move a third. If I increase the number of steps, the domain is divided into finer grain. Once we understand the idea of a domain, we can use it to make a series of steps of color. So I have the same hue saturation value node that we used before. I still have a slider plugged into saturation, but now for the hue, I have a range. If we preview this, we can see that the innermost circles are different. The outermost are the same. Well, why is this? I have a series of 20 circles, but I only have to find 3 increments or 4 steps of color here. So if I increase the number of steps, it will affect more of the circles. The upper limit on my slider right now is 10, so I need to increase that to 20 in order to cover all the circles. Let's now associate the number of steps in the range with the number of circles in the series. Let's unpreview this, move down to the next step in the file, and there's this little blue group that's been added, which does something really simple. It measures the length of the list, so the number of circles. It subtracts 1, and it makes that the input for the number of steps. If I preview this, and let's slide the saturation slider to make the colors a little bit more saturated, I can see that each circle in the series is treated with 1 step of color. Let's unpreview this and look at one more way of working with color. In this part, I've added a purple group, also very simple, which uses a gradient, which we can find in the parameters right where the color picker was over here, gradient. This gives a range of numbers associated with the domain that we set up, and also is a kind of visual representation. So if I double click on this, I can see there are points. I can slide these, and I can add new points in this tiny rainbow arc in the corner. Actually, if I select on the color in the arc, so here's yellow or red or blue, I can add in a new color. I can also change the color at the left and right of each of these slider points. So I have a point selected, I click on this color left, color right, and I can change that. And it can make for an abrupt line if I don't match the colors well. So if I want it to be yellow at the whole dot, I need to make both the left and the right side be yellow. Once I have this set up, these color values, we'll look at them in a panel as outputs, are as before given in hue saturation value, so a 3-digit number. And as you can see, there are as many of them as there are steps in my range. Finally, let's look at baking these colors into Rhino space. So if I preview this final node and I bake these lines, which I can always do, I can bake one node, and incidentally, it's also possible to go up to the pull down window, bake selected, or Command B, and bake a whole bunch of nodes at once. If I were to bake this, it's just lines, they don't have color. So this final step depends upon the plugin Human. So once you've installed it, it will just be a last tab up here. And there are 2 parts you'll need from here. One is create attributes, and the other is bake geometry. So they're the first 2 here. And the setup looks like this. The object attributes are everything that can be associated with a layer, so it's the same as the layer attributes. Well, the only one we're really interested in right now is color. So we'll take the output of our color, however we've produced it, whether gradient or a hue saturation node or whatever, and we'll plug that into color. And then we'll plug our geometry into geometry. So that's, for me, this series of circles. And then there's another input, bake, question mark. Every time a change is made, this node will bake it. So in order that you don't have 4 million copies of every different color you try, this is takes a true or a false. So you can put in, anytime you have a true false situation, what's called a Boolean toggle, so it's a switch basically, then you'll keep it set to off. By double clicking it, it goes to true, which is on, and then put it back to false. And for the moment that it was true, you have now baked these lines that do in fact have color. So on the top we see the Grasshopper info, and on the bottom we see things that have been baked into Rhino. If we look at the object properties of each of these, we'll see that the display color is not by layer as usual, but it's custom, and then we see the corresponding tone.